And I'm like, this is, the message behind my entire podcasting profession, right? We cannot sit here and agree that these extreme points of view are good for your health. All right, episode 10 of Pursuit of Balance. We're going to talk about a subject that I personally love talking about, and that's this idea of being open-minded versus closed-minded. And I think this is one of those mindset topics for me that is like a game changer for your life, because something I've always been super sensitive towards is just a very closed-minded point of view, right? And I kind of wrote down, I wanted to put some like examples together. So I wrote down, how many did I write down? I have 9 different ones. That I wrote down of like how being closed-minded can have a negative impact on that situation, right? And it was even funny when I was like going through the show notes the night before, as always, and I was just like writing stuff down, and I was typing into ChatGPT. What did I say? Oh, it was the religion and politics. So, and I want to say this, even just being careful with how people take this, but like for me, I've always like I didn't grow up in a religious family. I didn't even grow up in a political family. Like we didn't talk about politics. We didn't talk about religion. So as I started to become a young adult, and an adult, obviously through exposure and education myself, you start to learn about how politics work and, religious beliefs and all the different ways that people go about things like that. And what has been interesting to me is like I've always considered myself to be a very spiritual person. I don't consider myself to necessarily be a religious person, right? And I mean this in a non-offensive way. I think personally the way I view religion was always a little bit more closed-minded, and I view spirituality as more open-minded, right? Politics. I think it's very clear if you look at over the last like 10, 12 years, or at least like I feel maybe it's a little bit more apparent of how closed-minded the political conversations can be. And the reminder that I need that I don't want to be involved with politics ever, and why I choose to, I don't want to say avoid the conversations, because I don't think avoidance is ever the answer, but I feel somewhat almost triggered sometimes by like how people go about these conversations, right? So I think like when you think about what is the definition of open-minded, what is the definition of closed-minded? I think this definition of open-minded leaves room for growth, it leaves room for curiosity, leaves room to be empathetic of the other, leaves room to be a good listener and to ask questions and to learn and to grow, right? Because closed-minded, the way I view it is you know what you know, not that you can't learn more. Obviously, you can learn more maybe about the subject that you're specifically kind of putting yourself towards, but inherently, psychologically, you're kind of closing off the doors for other potential truths to be a thing, right? And you're kind of pigeonholing yourself in a sense for you to remain uncurious, right? Which is obviously the opposite of what I'm saying here of open-minded. You're a little less empathetic, maybe I think even depending on the subject, a lot less empathetic, because you're not viewing other people's standpoint and position in life, or even your own, right? This is not even necessarily a conversation from person to person. This could just be how you view it yourself. Um, so I think this dynamic of like being closed-minded versus being open-minded, and why it becomes such a troublesome thing for so many people, is because when you're closed-minded, you're stuck there, right? And I think this idea of living an optimal life is trying to find the balance of having an opinion that you can be strong about, but also being open-minded enough to see room for opportunity and room for growth, right? This is something my wife always says. I always say, like, what's one of the things that, like you've learned from me the most relationship? We always like to ask those questions. Well, what do you love about me the most? What did you learn about me the most? And she goes, I love that, like, you're so open-minded about situations, right? And she wants to just keep on applying that to her life, because I think a lot of this is going to be our influence as children, right? We grow up in a household that is going to influence your life most likely for the rest of your life, right? And then the people that you surround yourself with, the things that you listen to, the music, the television, the social media, we have all these different information sources and influences on our life. And that is going to shape our reality, right? And your reality is obviously based off all these external things, and more importantly, how you view those things. Being open-minded allows you to take all this stuff in, take time to kind of evaluate it, and make an opinion and form an opinion of your own, right? And I once again, there's some of these things I think are just going to come off offensive no matter what, but whatever. It's much easier to just be transparent here. This idea of being a sheep, right? I always use this as a metaphor. Being a sheep as a human is basically like, I am not even going to think for myself. I'm not going to use critical thinking. I'm just going to assume that the person I'm following knows what they're talking about, right? And we see this in every space of life, right? And that is a dangerous way to live. It's a comfortable way to live, right? And the reason why it's comfortable is it's much easier not to think for yourself. It's much easier to just be like, cool, like I view you as the professional. I view you as the leader. I view you as the figure that I'm trying to aspire to be. I view that your message resonates with me. So I'm just going to follow you, right? There's less friction. There's less work, right? It's just, I go about that. The downside of it is you're not having enough time. And this is something I talked about last week's episode of like the time for solitude, the time for reflection, the time to kind of like think for yourself, to kind of think what is right for you. And more importantly, why are we doing that? Right. I think that's like when you think about an open-minded conversation, the question of why we do something should be the thing that we're kind of focusing on, because like why you do something requires you to also think about why you're doing that. Right. So I want to kind of fire off some of these examples and then we can kind of expand from there. So the first one that I wrote down, and I kind of just give different things. And these are just basic examples of closed-minded situations and their impacts that they make, right? The first one I have is fitness and health, right? Someone insists that cardio is pointless and lifting is dangerous and refuse to try new methods. So I'm just going to basically give you an example and the impact that it has, right? And I see this all of the time. I literally had this, was it yesterday? Whatever. It was sometime earlier in this week. An appointment of mine on an intake assessment, and he was saying whatever, what was he talking about? Was it cardio or there was something about his training style? And he was basically saying like, no, this is what works. This is what knows works. And I wanted to challenge him because I'm like, if you're sitting here in front of me, there's a degree of something not working, right? Oh, it was just programming sustainability. So this was a person that was like, I remember now. He was like, I'm all in or I'm all out, right? And he was saying he doesn't need help with structure. He needs help with the motivation and accountability. And I was kind of challenging him a little bit. And I said, well, what if the structure was the thing that was basically creating a lack of accountability? Like if your structure had, variety kind of built in, sustainability, progress kind of planned and built into it, would you think you could be more accountable? And he goes, well, I think so, but I don't think that's a problem, right? And just the way that he was answering these questions, for me, kind of shows that's a limited belief, right? A limited belief by definition is being closed-minded. It's like it is a belief that we hold as humans near and dear to us that we view as right and the only thing that's right. And it's troublesome for someone's growth because in order for you to grow, you need to get those limited beliefs to not be limited. Like we want them to expand on their consciousness a little bit more. Like I want you to think about this. Like, how do I get you to become more accountable, in that situation, right? So obviously the next one we have is nutrition, right? This is obviously, I would say, kind of in my space a little bit. Like in the fitness and health side, we see this with, I don't know, I think the internet's always great at making everything kind of, seem way more dogmatic than normal and closed-minded and kind of their points of view. There's this guy called Naudi Aguilar, I think is his name. He's the one that runs Functional Patterns. And as a kid, I always loved functional patterns because I love functional training. And his entire social media presence is just talking shit about every other kind of modality of fitness. Powerlifting's terrible for you. Olympic lifting's terrible for you. Like just makes fun of everything, right? And I hate that approach as a human, right? Because it's just like you're choosing to just find the negative in everything, right? And the one thing I always like to say is there's context to everything. There's nuance in every single situation in life, right? Being open-minded is basically saying that like, and I try to really take that with my philosophy of training and something like I say this on my on-ramping with coaching is like my philosophy is forever growing, right? My philosophy is not what it is for the rest of its life. My philosophy is going to be built on me learning through new experiences, people, and education from different sources, taking what I love, removing what I dislike, optimizing based off data and client experience or myself, and then just kind of going through that. Like remaining open-minded, I think, as a business is what allows businesses to stay alive for a very long time. The ones that are not evolving, the ones that are not progressing with the market or with their clients are the ones that can become dinosaurs. They don't move forward, right? And I think about this with I was talking about this on Instagram a couple weeks ago with like social media presence, right? Like, I had a client that came from a podcast, right? He's like, oh, I looked you guys up. I saw you from an ad and I found your podcast. I listened to an episode. It resonated with me. And I was saying that I was like, hey, like, one of the things that I think a lot of small businesses are really undermining is the power of social media and the power of content, the power of marketing. And, I kind of use that as an example of like closed minded is basically thinking about in the business world, like, oh, I don't need to do that. What works, what worked 10 years ago has got to work now. And it's not really the reality. So I use that one with functional patterns because I just don't like that approach. Now, getting me to number two, I think nutrition space is the worst. It's like the carnivore people think vegetables are going to kill us. Vegan people think, obviously, well, there's some moral stuff to this that I do agree with. But, obviously that meat is bad. Keto thinks carb is bad, intermittent, like all these different strategies and kind of, approaches to nutrition. So the situation I wrote down is refusing to have new foods, right? So like the example I gave you, don't eat vegetables because those are going to be anti-nutrients that are going to be bad for your gut, bad for your health, or all carbs are bad for me, right? And it's just, I would say probably the most traumatic thing that we hear from most people is like, well, carbs are going to make me fat. I'm like, that's not the reality, right? So having those closed-minded points of views towards nutrition doesn't allow someone to grow and to explore with new strategies, right? It's like in the reality of nutrition space, having a balanced diet and maybe not having a name on your diet is probably the thing that's actually going to work the best, right? Like having this whole food approach, having this little bit more primal point of view of like, we eat vegetables and we're not going to be unhealthy. Now, is there nuance to it that like, yeah, some vegetables that the raw state have some anti-nutrients like phytates, lectins, oxalates, things like that can maybe inhibit the absorption of certain minerals and nutrients and maybe have a little bit of like some damaging on some gut health. Yeah, that's true. But context is how they're prepared, how they're cooked, the amount that you're eating. Like that's where I think this kind of closed-minded point of view is like we don't expand onto the context of what makes something work, right? Next one, stress and recovery, right? A high achiever who refuses to believe in rest days, meditation, or sleeping better, right? I struggle with this. I deal with a lot of clients that are high achieving people that don't view rest days or rest or meditation as something that's as important to them, or don't even view it maybe as important to them at all. Now, I think there has been this kind of with the longevity space and the biohacking space, there's been this kind of change in the market where people are becoming more exposed through education of other people, the importance of it. But it's something that we do see, right? A high achieving person or someone that's addicted to working out, just going too hard, too fast, and how that's going to impact their stress and how that's going to impact the recovery from life and training. Number four, relationships. Situation I put in a disagreement, someone refuses to see the other person's perspective, right? Kind of the example I brought up with like politics in the beginning of this, like I think this is something that unfortunately has divided so many people in relationships with their family at home, their parents, their brothers or sisters, their friends, significant others, their coworkers. Like I think about the relationships get divided by becoming closed-minded, right? Like I mentioned earlier, becoming closed-minded is basically saying, I am choosing to not be empathetic and understand your situation, right? The impact I put down is basically conflict escalates, relationships weaken, social support networks shrink, loneliness, higher stress, long-term health results that are basically just going to be dangerous, right? And the inability to communicate with humans is where we really start to lose society, right? And I talked about this in last week's episode with the distractions, with social media, with technology, like the technological era, the importance of social connection, the importance of solitude. But I think the importance of forming relationships, like, I want to be clear on this. I think it is important to find like-minded people, right? Your best friends, the people you're going to communicate with, the significant other you're going to live with the rest of your life, assuming these relationships are good and healthy, are generally going to be, you're going to have more common ground and more things you agree on than not. Now, that being said, I don't agree with everything that my family does. I don't agree with everything that my wife does. I don't agree. Like, we have different thought processes on certain things. And it's not in a negative way. It's just like, I'm like, oh, I have a different opinion on that. And that's cool, right? And like, it's much easier to say this on a podcast, like, oh, everything's cool, everything's hunky-dory. Like, you have your opinion, I have my opinion. I'm someone that always used to kind of like borderline confrontation and argument because I liked standing my ground. And I was, one thing that I've always disagreed with that what my dad has said is you can't teach an old monkey new tricks, right? Which is basically a philosophy on a foundation of closed-mindedness, right? Which is like, I'm a certain age, I understand what I understand, and I'm not going to learn anything new. So you don't need to teach me anything new, right? And I would always fight that if like, because I just liked the idea of like having an opinion back on things. As I've gotten older, as I've gotten more education, as I've kind of like developed a certain mindset and philosophy of living, I've understand that that's probably not a really great way to live. Like, I want to forever, hopefully, be the person that my children, my grandchildren, my coworkers, my friends, my wife can all have a positive impact on me, and I can change my opinion on them. There might be friction. It might be hard for me to admit that right away, but growth comes from changing your opinion through that implementation, right? Not just changing because other people say it, change it because like I've applied it, I've thought about it, I now agree with it. But that requires you to be open-minded, right? It requires you to be able to even take the information and not just, a lot of times you see this with people in arguments or sales, or conflict or conversation, is they're waiting to respond. They're not listening to then digest to then respond, right? Like when you're waiting to respond on something, you're not listening to that person. If I'm having a conversation with you and all you're doing is thinking about what you're going to say next, you're not being empathetic enough and actively listening to what I'm trying to say to understand my stance or understand my situation. And obviously that needs to go two ways, right? Next one I have, working career. The manager ignores feedback, refuses to learn new skills, or resist technology. For me, I would say kind of the example I gave you earlier. I say this example probably the most to people, if I can give you one that I think about with my work, is that coaches that have been coaching for a very long time, right? Coaches that are 30s, 40s, 50s, even 60s, that just do the same training style. They don't do any more education. Education for me is like even like the way I structure the compensation for my coaches at FL, like, 3 out of the 5 tiers get a education stipend annually to do towards education and certifications. And 2 out of the 5 tiers actually require you doing a certification once a year. And my philosophy on that is education is the thing that allows us to learn more, which allows us to critically think a little bit more about changing our philosophy and our opinion on training styles, on nutrition, on coaching, on stress and sleep, all the stuff we talk about. So I think if you're not educating yourself by asking questions with other people in person, workshops, online seminars, books, podcasts, you're choosing not to learn more. And I think the important thing to also understand is your education also should be maybe working on some of the conflicting opinions that you might have, right? Like learning more about the other side, because the more empathetic I can become, the better manager I can be, the better I can be as a husband, the better friend I can be, the better son and brother I can be, because I'm expanding my knowledge on other people's philosophies or other people's ways of doing things. And that expansion allows me to get smarter, right? And I think being closed-minded is a pretty dumb way to live because you're choosing to not explore other ways of thinking or other ways of living and other ways of acting. And, I think about this with traveling and vacation. I think like, the cool thing about traveling is it gives you an expansion on different ways that other people live, right? And it gives you a different reality. And I think those realities are important for us because like those are the things that allow us to go, oh, like, well, they don't do that there. Like, why are we doing that here? Like, why, I think about that with work, right? Like the European summers or how different countries, like, have different work hours. So, like, but then there's other countries like China where it's like 40 hours a work week is actually pretty low. They're working sometimes 60, 80 hours a week. You get these different philosophies. And I think, like, when you travel, when you meet new people, I'm like, my wife always says, like, please don't be too quiet when you meet new people. But I'm very quiet when I meet new people because I just like to I want to hear them talk. I want to see, like, I want to make sure I know how I can talk, what's offensive, what's not offensive, because I tend to be a little brash sometimes. But more importantly, I think I really want to learn. I want to kind of learn, like, how they talk or their philosophies. And I love, like, in conversation, I say this in sales all the time. My sales example is like, I always use dating as an example in sales. Something I tell the sales team is like, if I were to go meet somebody at the bar, if I was single, I'm not single, babe, so don't worry. I know you're listening to this. I would basically start to ask questions about them, right? I wouldn't talk about myself, right? I'll ask questions about them, right? And I think that is being empathetic. I think that's being an active listener. And that's where a lot of people that suck at communication and that are closed-minded, that are selfish, or, have a trouble with communication in sales, like I said, they tend to struggle because all they're doing is trying to talk about themselves, their product, their service, what I can do, what la la la. Like that doesn't work. Like that's not how humans work. So I think taking the time to be able to be an active listener is what allows you to kind of be a little more open-minded, right? As far as how you appreciate that. Next one, mental health, number 6. So refusing to try therapy, journaling, or any form of emotional kind of exploration. I would say I probably fall in this category a little bit. Is probably being a little close-minded, and this is also, now that I say that out loud, I think it's interesting to, to look at the things in life that we view as kind of areas or things that we're a little bit more closed-minded or like kind of headstrong about versus other areas that we're a little bit more open-minded. I think like being open-minded versus closed-minded is on a continuum, right? It's dynamic. There's going to be certain things in life that you're going to become more opinionated about over time. And this is one thing that I try to be empathetic with, my parents or just the generations older than me or anybody that's older than me is like the more time that you've gone through things, the more data you collect. The more data that collects that reinforces a certain opinion, the more you create a confirmation bias towards that thing, right? And I think this is a good and bad thing, right? Because yes, it's hard for you to remain open-minded if you're a 7-year-old that's lived a life a certain way, that's experiences things from people or things or work a certain way. It's like, yeah, it's much harder to convince somebody that's later in life to be like, you need to be more open-minded. Now, no matter what, I think it's still going to be an argument or a thing that I would push, but I can understand why that would happen because after so many decades of reinforcement, like confirmation bias is basically this bias that we create that once we have an opinion on something, we start to kind of attach things that like agree with that opinion, right? But I think it's really like the sciencey way to, I forget what it's called, reactive. I don't know. RAS is I know what it's short for, but it's basically this part in our brain that like if I was looking to buy a car, right? Like me and my wife want to buy a car. We want to get a nice, maybe a Range Rover, an X5M. What happens is our brain's going to start to see those all over the road, right? And that's not on accident. That is basically how confirmation bias is actually working. Is basically like your brain starts to go, oh, yeah, that's the car I like, or I start seeing it more often. It's not because there's more on the road, it's because your brain's actually on the lookout for it, right? So I think about this with like, closed-minded opinions or confirmation bias is like a lot of times our body and our brains are even designed to start to look and seek information that is going to agree with the opinion that I have on something, right? Which is why it's very normal for someone to reinforce their opinion on that, right? So back to this mental health one, refusing therapy or journaling. I will say on the therapy side, and it's interesting because like for me being a coach, you would think that like I encourage people to do therapy, but I also think that it's the thing that I probably have the most pushback on. And I don't know why. I'm just going to give you my opinion on this, but for me personally, like me and my wife in the pandemic, she was like, I think we should do like couples therapy. I think it'd be good for us to like talk and do these things. And I gave a lot of push, a lot of push, a lot of push. We did one thing together, and that's the only therapy session, quote unquote, that I've ever done. It was like one-on-one together. And I did not like it at all. I was like, this is a waste of time. This is a waste of my money. This is a waste of everything, right? Like, I don't need to be dedicating my energy towards this. Close-minded, right? And it's not that it doesn't work. You also need to remember it's like someone going to a training session and expecting the results to happen in one session, right? So it's like, I can get both sides of it, right? I've opened up to it more and more just because I had to convince myself that being open-minded is not something you make a decision on and it changes right away. Being open-minded is something that takes work. So that's something I want to like empower you guys listening to this, that like becoming open-minded in life is something that's going to take weeks and months and possibly years or even decades for people to actually change, but it requires you consciously making effort towards that change, right? Like I don't want to just like bash like, oh, people don't need therapy. They really just like my argument was like they just need to go to the gym, they need to fix their lifestyle, they need to get some good hobbies, they need to like hang out with their friends more and like do the things that are gonna make someone happy so you don't need therapy. But in reality, sometimes you need a therapist to remind you those things that maybe influence the way that you're thinking about those things or influence you or educate you on the decisions you need to make to actually make a positive change. So I'm less bashful of it now. 7, I got aging and longevity. Older adults refusing to learn new things. I kind of talked about this one already, but like obviously from the science side of it, losing neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is just like this. It's basically our brain forming these connections from neurons and new decisions and curiosity that we live with our life, right? Being curious allows you to think about things different ways, which is actually good for the brain, right? So a little bit on the sciencey side of like aging and longevity is like you're reducing your quality of life also in a sense by choosing to not be curious. And that's where I think like when we look at the episode I did probably a couple months ago, the the achievement trap years where I was talking about what we can learn from adults and what we can learn from kids. The part about kids that I said that we can all learn from as young adults, adults or seniors is like curiosity, play, having fun, enjoying those type of things. And that's something I think requires you being open-minded, that like, a lot of us need to look at life in that light, right? Not just being like, I just work, I just go home. It's like we fall in this routine. The routine is very natural for us to fall into because once again, habits that are already created are less energy required to keep them going, right? Creating a new habit or removing a current habit requires a lot more energy and there's a lot more friction. So it's much easier to say no to that and creating new things, right? Next one I have, social and cultural, refusing to engage with people who hold different political, cultural, religious beliefs. I opened up the conversation today on today's episode with that. I think this one is, I think this might be the hardest one, right? And I think that it's the hardest because it's the most dogmatic on people's points of view. It's the hardest one for people to come to an agreement on because we've created such this polarized extreme, and like this is where I do blame media a lot, honestly. Like the unfortunate part about how the human psyche works is we are more intrigued by fear, and that's kind of why this fear mongering style of media works that way. Social media and the algorithm is gonna basically just can be conducive to confirmation bias. But over time, what we're doing is basically we're creating these really, really extreme norms, right? And I had this conversation, I'm not going to say his name, but I saw a post on Instagram and someone that doesn't live here, even in the States anymore. And it was something talking about like how bad America is and how bad the States are. And I felt a little sensitive towards it because I was like, obviously a little territorial. It's like, hey, I live in America. I love America. My parents are not from this country. My parents are both immigrants. They're from Canada and London. But they created everything they did in their life in America. And I'm born in California, born and raised. And I'm kind of like, I've always been like a localism type of guy. So I felt a little triggered by it immediately. And I remember commenting on it saying like, I was like, hey, like, that's not the reality. Life was good over here, right? And it kind of goes to show you that like what we see on television or social media or media, whatever in general, whatever we're kind of getting our sources from, tends to be way more extreme than what's actually happening in the current reality of life. Like if you were to just like, you didn't have TV, you didn't have a phone, you didn't have a newspaper or magazine to read. If you just went about your day every day, I guarantee that almost every single person would have a completely different opinion on the political status and the status of America or just where we are in life. But the stimulus and this information and this fear mongering that comes in all the time makes it really, really hard. And I'm as someone that considers myself very open-minded, I get why that obviously has an influence on us on a negative way or positive way, however you want to view it. But like it definitely has an impact on us. So when I think about the social cultural side, like the refusing to engage with people that disagree with your opinion makes sense. Cause like, why would I want to have conflict? Well, I kind of maybe I'm wrong by saying this because I was saying earlier that I kind of like confrontation and argument sometimes, but I think I've grown to move past that. But I was like that earlier in my life. But that's really because like there's a lack of empathy towards creating relationships or understanding other people's opinions or kind of ways of living on life or why those things happen. And I think just the avoidance for most people tends to be easier. And the people that aren't avoiding it are just going head to head with people that are closed-minded. And that's why I tend to put politics at like the top for me of like when I think about what is like a closed-minded person look like. There's plenty of people that are not closed-minded that have political opinions and views and votes and all those things. So I'm not saying it's just like that's like a one size fits all. But I think there's more people in that group that have struggled mentally a lot more so later, like more so now than ever, because of how strong their beliefs are around it. And I think beliefs are such an empowering thing for us to have because, like, I always say this on the mindset side, in order to actually make change sustainably or really effectively, there needs to be this just like ungodly desire and belief in yourself or belief in a thing to actually go and do that thing. And that's where I think a lot of change does come from, right? But I think how we go about finding middle ground between any party, I'm not just bringing politics back again, but any disagreement that we have in life in any situation, the vegetarians and the carnivores, the training style people, like the politics, the religious wars that we have, all these things, having a middle ground, I think, is obviously what we would think would be like the best way for us to evolve as humans, because the extremist on both sides is A, what makes it seem so terrible, but B, also what makes it impossible for us to even find middle ground. Because all I'm doing is telling you why I'm right. I'm not asking you things about your opinion, things that I can be open-minded about. And that's why I definitely would say that that's probably the most sensitive subject for so many people. But like, just use the proof and the data. Like, it's such a closed-minded situation, and we cannot sit here and agree that these extreme points of view are good for your health. And I'm like, this is, the message behind my entire podcast and profession, right? From an optimal health perspective, we want to remain to a degree open-minded. We want to be able to be empathetic and loving and peaceful about other people's ways of living, and hopefully find ways that we can kind of move towards more middle ground. And this is why, this pursuit of balance thing is such an important message for me, is like, there is things that work on everyone's opinions. For you as an individual, there might be things that work better than others. Doesn't mean it doesn't work for other people. Like, what my way of living is not going to be your way of living. What I'm even telling you right now, you might completely disagree with. But like, trying to find ways for you as the individual, as a listener right now, like, how do I become more open-minded where I can be, more open to change over time? Last one, personal growth. Someone rejecting feedback or constructive criticism. Obviously, the impact that has is they stop involving and they lead to stagnation in their career or stagnation in their life, relationships, whatever it might be. Constructive criticism, I think, is hard for myself for sure. I hated that when my dad would tell me that. I always, like, the running joke in my family is like, my mom, no matter if I played a good game or a bad game, but even now with golf, I could have a terrible shot. She's like, good shot. Just mom trying to be supportive. Dad would be the opposite. It's like, he would always be like, no matter what, I could have a fantastic game. It's like, yeah, so these are the things I think we can do better here. It's like, it would give me little tips. And that's their parenting style. And I'm used to it. There's no wrong or right, something behind that. But constructive criticism, I think me and all my brothers, maybe my youngest brother was probably the best at this, something that I struggle with. But I think criticism, constructive or deconstructive, I think how it's taken is obviously going to be another way that it can be handled, but is important for us to have, because criticism is something that, like, is another person's opinion, right? And I feel that a lot with work sometimes, right? Like, I try to find this balance of, like, I want to run the business the way I want to run it, and I want to find coaches and clients that kind of fit into our culture and fit into our model, and like, that's a beautiful thing about small business is, like, we can do that. But then there's also the other end of it where it's like, oh, running a business is 100% about other people. And, the client is always right and all these things. And I'm like, fuck that. Client's not always right. Like, there's some people that are just assholes that just are not going to fit our model. But I'm like, but I also want to think about that. Like, how do I, you got to find that balance of, like, criticism of, like, okay, that's your opinion. I get it. Is there actually anything that I can go home and take about that and be like, okay, maybe you're all right. And like, a lot of the things that I've evolved, even just in compensation, how I run the gym, the business, have been criticisms from coaches or clients to me. And at first it's hard, but that's what allows me to grow, is actually taking information from other people's opinion and remaining open-minded, no matter how hard it is. So that's kind of just the last little note I want to leave with you guys. Like, open-minded versus closed-minded, it's continuum, it's dynamic, like I said. Working towards a more open-minded life is going to allow you to have a lot more freedom, a lot more love, a lot more empathy, a lot more curiosity. And it's going to be something that I can guarantee you, and I promise you, that will make a dramatic change in your life. But it is hard, and it's something that requires work, and something that requires daily repetition towards. Like, there's going to be things in life that are going to challenge your opinion on how you view something, right? Taking the second to digest the information, having a moment of silence, not responding right away, listening to how that impacts them, and asking those questions. I think, like, can you help me understand a little bit more of where you're coming from? Like, doing those things in conversations and arguments and sales pitches, whatever it might be, I think are good questions to ask. People that ask questions, I always say, from an employment standpoint, I can tell the people that are going to grow the fastest based off the amount of questions they ask. Ones that don't ask questions, the ones that just talk all the time. God gave us 2 ears, or the universe, whatever you believe in, gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth, which I love this quote, which is like, we're built to listen, right? So if we're talking all the time, we're not learning. If we're listening all the time, we're able to learn. But the talking should come in forms of active questioning, right? I want to ask so I can learn. Doesn't mean you should never talk and never share your opinion. I think it's very important for you to share your opinion because you need to be strong in your stance for what you believe in, but just be soft enough in it to understand that maybe it's not right for everyone else. Or also, maybe it's not right at all. And like, I need to actually open my mind to like, okay, if there's enough people saying that, there has to be some influence on maybe why that's right or wrong, right? So take those moments. Like I said, it's something I definitely can ramble on forever, but I think this idea of being open-minded is just a game changer for so many of us in life. You're going to have your things in life, right? You're going to have your religious beliefs. You're going to have your political beliefs, like those two things I brought up in the beginning of the episode. You're going to have your beliefs on nutrition, your beliefs on exercise, but don't let those beliefs create a wall around other possibilities because growth in life comes from curiosity. The growth that you have in your life is also going to come from you remaining open-minded and viewing these things as, how do I optimize my life? How do I change in a positive way? And how you did it 10 years ago, unfortunately, might not work today, but that's okay. All right, guys. Well, that's it for today. I will see you guys next week.